Such cute little owlets. Can I get them to blend in? Let's see. Hi everyone, I'm Catherine, the artist behind Bigelow Fine Arts. I'm finishing up the forest owlets in Kirby Rosanes' Fragile World. I have the full list of colors on my blog on Patreon, so go grab that if you need it. This is going to be a longer video, but it just wasn't worth splitting it up. I want to get the mushrooms out of the way first. I begin with a light base layer of burnt ochre just to cover them up and give me a starting point, although this is a little more orange than I wanted. I add in some shadows with sepia, keeping it to the bottom of the mushrooms and the back of the mushrooms. I layer in more burnt ochre to get more layers down. I bring in burnt sienna to tone down the orange of the burnt ochre. And that is this clump of mushrooms. I worked on just the one so I could try to get a feel for the colors. And while I wasn't overly happy with how orange they started, I feel like they are better with the sienna. I was thinking something along the lines of chicken of the woods type mushrooms, which I recall as having an orangish color, even though these don't look like chicken of the woods. Next clump, and I start the same way, with a base layer of burnt ochre. This time, I come in with the burnt sienna and tone down the orange right away. I try adding in a little yellow ochre for some highlights on the tops of the mushrooms. I bring in some terracotta, which only intensifies the orange, so may be worth skipping if you don't want your mushrooms to be too orange. I come back in with burnt sienna for more layers, and I also add in a base layer to the last clump of mushrooms. Time for some shadows, and I come in with sepia and work in the shadows at the bottoms and around some of the mushrooms. And finally for the main subject, onto the owlets. I will work up one owlet just to get a feel for the color and the pattern of colors on the feathers. I start with raw umber, blocking in the darker parts of the head. And I realized that the umber was a little off in color, but it doesn't matter. There will be enough layers to cover this up later. I come in with nougat and block in more of the darker parts of the head. With the walnut brown, I begin to block in some of the shadows and blocking in some of the darker areas of the chest. With the Van Dyke brown, I am coming in and beginning to refine some of the colors and shaping on the head and part of the chest. To bring up the contrast, I come in with sepia and really get those shadows blocked in. This is part of the left side of the head, around the eyes, and under the neck ruff. These owls almost have a mustache on their face. For the lighter parts of the head, I need to put something down to show the lighter color. I begin with warm gray 3. The light areas of the face and chest appear white, but they will actually be made from other colors reflected back onto the light areas. So I want to make sure I layer in some of the browns from the stump. I work in more nougat on the head, as well as working in some light shading onto the light parts around the eyes and chest. I lightly add in shadows around the eyes, then touch up the shading around the rest of the head and chest. I still need more layers and I need to darken everything up a little more, so I bring in walnut brown and add in a few light layers. I always work in light layers, and sometimes I need to come back in with the same color several times to darken the color and fill in the tooth of the paper. For the eyes, I begin with dark Naples ochre and cover most of the iris. For the shadow at the top of the eye, I block that in with light yellow ochre, then I add in a light layer of sepia to help darken it a little more. I add in a little burnt ochre, also to the top of the eye to help fill in the shadow a little more and blend the colors together a little. More light yellow ochre, again for blending and to add in more layers to the eye. For the rest of the iris, I add in some Naples yellow to blend with the ochre I put down earlier. I blend the entire eye with more dark Naples ochre. And for the final touch, I come in with black and darken all of the line art, filling in the area really well. This helps make the eye pop a lot more. If this is your first time here, welcome! I have the playlist linked above for the rest of this page, but feel free to jump right in here. For those of you who are returning, I'm so glad you're here to see the final picture, and I hope you've been coloring along with me. On to the rest of the owl. I now have a little bit of a better idea of the colors and which are working together to give me the color I want. So on to the rest of the owl. I come in with walnut brown and first touch up the areas I already blocked in. I then keep working my way down the owl's front, blocking in the darker feathers before jumping onto the wings. At first I started just blocking in a light layer over all of the feathers, but I stopped and began blocking in just the darker parts of the feathers. I thought it might be easier in the long run. If you look closely at the feathers, there are some shading lines that cover part of the feather. I fill in just that part with the walnut brown, and that better simulates the banding pattern of the wings. The good thing about nature is that no one will know if I am slightly off on the pattern on the wings, so don't worry if you missed a spot, or added in more walnut brown. No one will know. Now, a person's face, on the other hand, that might be noticed. I come in with sepia and begin to block in the shadows. I didn't mention it earlier, but the tail is also banded. There is a light strip across the middle of the tail feathers, and after I add in some sepia, it is a little easier to see where it is located. For the wings, I add in the sepia right where I placed the walnut brown, a little darker on the side up against another feather. On to the nougat. Every time I pick a color, I go back and refine the colors on the other sections before adding in more layers to the current area. This gives me more layers and fills everything in better. I can now add in a light layer over the entire wing to begin adding color to the light portions of the wing. Again, they look white, but will not be a true white. Rather, they will be picking up reflected colors from the stump, and this will help them better blend into their surroundings. I come in with the Van Dyke brown and darken up the contrast and shading a little more, while also adding in some more layers to the bandings on the wing. I bring in black because I really want to get the contrast a little higher. Each feather is overlapped by at least 2 feathers above it. Where the banding is already blocked in and meets with another feather, I add in some black to create the shadow from the overlapping feathers. For the beak, I start with dark Naples ochre, blocking in the whole beak. I bring in the burnt ochre and begin to block in a shadow on the left side of the beak. Left for no reason, but I already shaded in the left side of the head, so left it is. I use the Naples yellow on the right side of the beak to keep it bright. I add in a little light yellow ochre to the tip of the beak. The tip of the beak is a little more orange than the rest, so I come in with more burnt ochre followed by terracotta to darken up the tip. With the warm gray 3, I add in more layers to the light parts of the owl. I'm covering the paper and slightly darkening the parts that look overly white right now, and blending into the darker areas I already filled in, especially on the wings with the banding. I come through with the sepia and really work the shadows in contrast. And finally, to finish off this little owlet, I come in with a touch more warm gray 3 for the face, and now that I have the one owl, the other two should be a little easier. The color order will be a little different, more refined, but they will work up about the same as this first one. I start with the nougat, blocking in the darker parts of the head and chest. I want to have an idea of what should be dark and what needs to remain light. I come in with walnut brown and darken up the dark areas now that I know where they should be. This makes refining the areas a little easier. I also go through and begin adding in the banding pattern on the wings, again allowing the line art to dictate where I place the darker bands of color. I come in with more nougat and slowly build up color in the lighter areas with a layer of nougat. I fill in the eyes and beak, since they take the same colors. It is essential to make sure there is a shadow at the top of the eye where the brow, or feather ridge in this case, will cast a bit of a shadow. It doesn't have to be super dark, but it should be there. And for that, I come in with sepia to make sure I have a little shadow. And while I have the sepia in hand, I go through and build up the shadows across the rest of the two owls. For the most part, I have the major areas blocked in with some color. So now I need to add in more layers and refine the color and contrast even more. Every time I add a layer to one section, I need to balance that with layers to the other sections to make sure the contrast doesn't get washed out. I come in with Bistre and add in more layers to the lighter parts of the dark sections. I come in with walnut brown and add in more layers to the darker parts of the darker sections. This is me balancing out the contrast. When I darken the lighter area, I need to darken the darker areas. For the chest and lightest areas, basically the colors that look white, I add in a layer of warm gray 3 over those areas. I also come through with walnut brown, and along the side of each little half feather impression on the chest, I put in a little shadow. Nothing too dark, just a hint of shadow that helps fade out some of the harshness of an ink line. I come in with black and again add in shadows on the wing feathers near the banding pattern to make it darker. I use nougat to fill in another layer over the light areas to fill in the paper a little more. I give the owls a final touch-up with walnut brown. And while I have it out, I go and touch up the lower branches just a little to darken up the shadows a little more. They already stand out against the stump, but the thinner branches looked a little too bright, and I touch up the shadows a little more. And that is it! I love how this page turned out. The owlets were fun to color and the stump was an interesting challenge. So much brown! Thanks for joining me on these cute little owlets today. Let me know below or on social media if you colored along. I'd love to know how you did. I'll be working on a new page next video, so make sure you're subscribed so you can join in on the color along from the beginning. I want to thank you all so much for coming along and joining in with me on this coloring journey. I appreciate all my subscribers and look forward to more of you joining in and coloring along with me. Please like, share, and subscribe to help that happen. Until next time, happy coloring.